How are you today?
Oh, just fine, Doctor. I got a letter for you.
Oh. Okay. I'll take a few moments here to read this. Dear Joyce, I'm sending you patient Arthur D. Tomasino, age 53, blind since infancy. Prognosis incurable until a recent advancement of surgical technique. Now, my friend, you are the only doctor in the world who can restore Mr. Tomasino's sight. And I warn you, he knows it. Oh, looks like you've come from quite a long way to see me.
Wool.
I beg your pardon?
Wool. Your jacket is wool. Beautiful stuff.
How'd you know?
The nose never miss.
All right. What else do you already know about me?
Well, your desk. Indonesian teakwood. Very nice. And your clock is electric. Very good. Very nice. My conclusion? You're a very good doctor. Very rich doctor.
Oh, Mr. Tomasino, you see very well for a blind man.
Well, doctor, 50 years ago, I don't know why, God took my eyes. But all of my life, I have tried to learn all I could about the world. Because in my heart, I had faith that someday God would send me a very good doctor, very rich doctor, like you, to give me back my eyes so I could see all I have learned about the world.
I think I know how you feel, but I must tell you that I may not be able to help you.
Why not?
Well, it's rather complicated to explain, but you see, it is true that my operation can restore the eye's ability to see, and we've done it for several people. But you may discover something that they've discovered since their sight has been restored.
Which is?
Well, which is that merely seeing the world isn't the same as knowing what you see.
Doctor, what is it you are trying to tell me?
What I'm trying to tell you...
No. Streets I can cross. With traffic, no problem. Up I know. Down I know. Big, small. I can go to the zoo, and I know all of the animals. I go downtown. I know the streets, the cars, the shops. You must help me. Help me to see the world I have loved so long.
To know the world we see. How do we do it? Over 300 years ago, in 1637, the French philosopher René Descartes performed a rather unusual experiment. He cut a small window in the back of an eye he'd dissected from an ox. Now, he covered the window with a piece of paper. Then he faced the eyeball toward the light. And lo and behold, a tiny image of his room appeared upside down on the paper. And so Descartes became the first man to prove that the human eye captures an image of the external world. And he was very excited by his discovery, of course, but he was also very disturbed. He asked himself, how does that flat little upside-down world in the eye become the life-size, three-dimensional, right-side-up world of the mind? Well, 300 years later, psychologists are still asking that question. They're learning that there's a lot more to perception than meets the eye. Visual perception begins with light. Light from the sun makes all things visible. In response to light, receptors in the eyes send electrical impulses along to the brain. Each impulse is a sensation, a recording of something by the visual sense. But sensations are not the same as perceptions. The difference is a little like the difference between sounds and a symphony.
Duty, 2 before 16.
Without sounds, there could be no symphony. But a complex process in the composer's brain, not his ear, organizes and refines sound into music. Well, the brain subjects the eye's sensations to a similar process. Visual sensations travel to the brain's most complex area, the cerebral cortex. The cortex integrates an incoming sensation with everything the brain remembers about the world. The result is a perception, a mental combination of what the eye sees with what the brain knows, giving meaning to the world we live in. But even a seemingly simple perception isn't simple at all. For example, how does an archer perceive the correct distance from himself to the target? As his eye records its image, his brain rapidly assembles a variety of information. First of all, it already knows that the target is really much bigger than it looks. Because it's far away, the eye sees it as a tiny square. But the brain knows the true dimensions of a target. So it discounts the small image reported by the eyes and substitutes the target's actual size. Our perception of the target is a combination of the eye's image and the brain's prior knowledge about targets. And knowing the target's actual size is one crucial element in judging its distance. The eye records an object like a camera, smaller if far away, larger if close. But the brain remembers its constant or real size. If we couldn't maintain this size constancy, you and I might think that this is a film of tiny toy cars seen close up, not real cars seen far away. And we might think that our archer has a mighty small target to hit. Size constancy is only one clue our brain uses to perceive distances correctly. Look at the street and the palm trees. In the distance, they seem to get closer together until they almost meet. This is linear perspective, another clue to perceiving distance. The brain knows that these lines never really get closer together. The eye only sees them that way. The brain makes use of linear perspective to identify distance. But the eyes do help perceive depth. Each eyeball records its own separate and slightly different image of the world. The individual images are, as we know, only two-dimensional. But somehow the brain fuses them into one image with 3 dimensions. And when the eyes turn inward to view an object close up, tension in their muscles signals the brain that something isn't far away at all. The Earth's atmosphere provides still another of the many clues to distance. This one is aerial perspective. Look at this picture of the New York skyline. The buildings in the foreground are clearer and more colorful than the buildings farther away. The reason? Air pollution, which obscures distant objects. We use this aerial perspective to help judge distances. So, making a bullseye is even harder than you thought. Because our eyes can't see depth or distance, our brain must perceive them. In fact, the brain must work constantly to organize the flood of input from the eyes into a coherent, stable picture of reality. The brain must perceive a structure in the barrage of sensations bombarding it from the eyes, whether or not the eyes report structure. And in general, the brain does a pretty good job of this. But like any complicated process, perception can go wrong. The brain can be fooled. It isn't hard at all to perceive something that you're not really seeing. The brain organizes sensations into perceptions according to its expectations about the world. But sometimes the world doesn't meet the brain's expectations. The result is an illusion. Look closely at the two vertical lines. Which is longer? Obviously, the one on the right. But when they're compared without their angles, they turn out to be exactly the same length. This is the famous Mueller-Lyer illusion. Why do we think that one line is longer than its twin? Psychologists believe that we do so because we're used to seeing these figures in a three-dimensional context, like the inside corners of rooms or the outside corners of buildings. Both have a depth dimension. An outside corner projects toward us. An inside corner recedes away from us. The brain knows this from experience. The Mueller-Lyer figure presents the lines and angles without depth. But since the brain expects depth, it perceives longer and shorter lines anyway. Psychologists have discovered several of these rather simple illusions. The abstract figures can be amusing brain teasers. But when the illusion isn't so abstract, it can be rather unsettling. Well, it looks like you've been fooled again. This is the very mysterious Ames room, named after its designer, Adelbert Ames. The Ames room isn't really rectangular, but your eyes can't see that. The man isn't really getting smaller. He's getting farther away. He's walking along a wall that isn't really parallel to the foreground, but actually recedes to make the Ames room a sort of triangle. But you don't know that. So you perceive him as moving sideways instead of away from you. And so your brain is forced to make an unconscious decision. Should it perceive the correct sizes of the people, or what it thinks is the correct shape of the room? Because your brain expects all rooms to be rectangles, not triangles, it decides to misperceive the people as an illusion. Not all illusions are created by expectations. Most of us are more familiar with those caused by visual defects. Here's one that's quite well known: color blindness. If you inherited the commonest form of color blindness, your world would look something like this. No reds or greens. And if you were one of a very small group of people, about 1 in 40,000, your world would look like this. World of the totally colorblind. Now, whether they're caused by unfulfilled expectations or visual defects, illusions are perceptions that don't accurately reflect the external world. If we perceive two equal lines as unequal, or green grass is blue, the world we perceive isn't the world that exists outside our minds.
I don't know how to explain this, but I actually saw it. It actually scared me at first. Was the body of me slowly dissolving. The skin, all the meat would go completely from under my skin. I couldn't see any blood. Finally, only the skin was hanging on the bones, and I was lying as a skeleton, but completely conscious of my heart beating and being still like I had a mind.
This man is describing his hallucination, a complete break between his own mind and the outside world. Hallucinations are not illusions. Illusions, remember, are misperceptions of things that exist outside the mind. Hallucinations happen when the brain's complex operation somehow produces perceptions which have nothing to do with anything reported by the senses. The brain's own storehouse of remembered images takes the place of incoming sensations. Reality becomes a completely internal affair. Our patient's hallucination was deliberately induced by doctors using the drug LSD. Several drugs can cause hallucinations, and so can severe mental illnesses, like schizophrenia. People who are extremely isolated can also hallucinate. Sailors alone on long voyages have reported some very strange experiences. Now, you might be thinking that none of this has anything to do with you, since you're not on drugs, or schizophrenic, or alone in the middle of the ocean. You don't live in an Ames room, and you don't hallucinate. But illusions aren't limited to abnormal or experimental conditions. Suppose you're a pilot coming in for an ordinary landing. You must make a routine judgment. How long is your runway? Well, the weather's clear, visibility is good. But can you still be fooled? Yes. Remember, your brain perceives everything within a surrounding context. Look at this exercise from a pilot training film. Which line is longer, AX or AY? AX, of course. Until we remove the background. AY and AX are actually equal. It's the principle of the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Context can create distortions. Or suppose you're a painter painting a canvas. You have a problem. It's not an unusual problem. It's inherent in the materials of painting. The world has 3 dimensions. The canvas, like the eye's retina, has only 2. How does a painter make his 2-dimensional canvas look like his 3-dimensional subject? Well, for a long time, painters didn't think they could. Then, during the European Renaissance, artists began to discover some of the clues the brain uses to perceive distance and depth. Remember aerial perspective? This painting uses it to achieve depth. The farther objects are hazier and lighter in color. And these paintings, using converging lines, linear perspective, to suggest great distance. But you may object that what's an everyday problem for a painter or an airline pilot isn't for you. Fair enough, but surely you've had this experience. What experience, I hear you saying? All I'm doing is sitting here watching an old movie. That's precisely the experience I mean. Watching a movie. A motion picture is an illusion. The images themselves don't move. They're still photographs. But when we pass enough of them fast enough in front of a light, they appear to move. Your brain can't work fast enough to perceive one image out of the hundreds flashing in front of your eyes. So it perceives one continuous image, a movie. Well, human visual perception is clearly neither simple nor foolproof. It's an immensely complicated affair, which is, at best, imperfect. But with all its flaws, this joint effort of the eye and brain is our principal means of comprehending reality. What happens when the link between eye and brain has been cut? When Arthur Tomasino was blind, He perceived the world through his other senses: hearing, touch, smell. And as we saw, these gave him a pretty good picture of the world, but not, of course, good enough for Arthur. He persuaded the doctor to perform the operation. When the bandages came off, Arthur was ecstatic.
I can see. I can see.
The operation was a success. After a lifetime of darkness, he could see. But did he have visual perception? Arthur soon discovered that the doctor had been right. Familiar objects remained familiar only to his other senses. His eyes could see, but his brain couldn't process visual sensations. Arthur's world as a sighted man wasn't what he'd hoped for. Judging actual size over distances was nearly impossible. One day he nearly fell to his death trying to examine the tiny toy cars in what he thought was a shallow gutter, several stories high. Activities that seeing should have made easier were, in fact, more difficult. As a blind man, Arthur could cross a busy street without much trouble. His hearing gave him some sense of his distance from cars, and his touch sensed his distance from the curb. But when he tried to use his eyes, he was terrified. As months went by, Arthur slid further and further into deep depression. All his life he had lived for his dream. Now he knew that the dream could never be, and he had lost more than 50 years of sight. Eventually, he returned by choice to the only world he could ever really know, the world of darkness. Arthur Tomasino is a fictitious person, but his story is created from the experiences of those very few people who actually have regained sight late in life. Their stories are sad and often tragic, but they have given psychologists data to help answer an important question. Are we born with our ability to perceive, or do we have to learn reality? As might be expected, psychologists have evidence that supports both possibilities.
What we're doing today is an experiment on how distorting goggles affect your vision. So what I'd like you to do, you see this rod out here? Just reach out under the table and point right at it. Fine, once more. Okay, now we'll put the goggles on you. And when they're on, I want you again to just point where you see the rod. Okay, hold your finger up there for a second. Okay, now these goggles are displacing your vision about 14 degrees, so you're pointing right where you see it. And now I'll give you a chance to see where you're pointing. Point again.
Oh shit.
Go on. Just keep pointing fast.
Oh, wait a minute. There.
Keep pointing.
What's remarkable here is the quickness with which the girl's brain corrects for the distortion caused by the goggles. Her brain has the flexibility to overcome inaccurate sensations. Experiments like this make some psychologists believe that we learn most, if not all, visual perception after birth. They say that perceptual flexibility is characteristic of learned human behavior, which can adapt to new circumstances, sometimes too well.
Okay, let's put this back. And just point once where you see that rod. Point right at it. Okay, fine. Now let's take the goggles off. Put your arm down. You're back to normal vision. And again, point where you see the rod. Are you pointing right at it?
Yep.
Okay, let me show you where you're pointing.
Those who think visual perception is learned say that it begins early and continues all through life. A construction worker learns to perceive the world correctly from 40 stories up. Size constancy may be learned. But not everyone agrees that all visual perception is learned. It's possible that everyone is born with the ability to recognize heights and their dangers. This is the best-known experiment designed to prove that perception of depth is innate. It's the famous visual cliff. The left half of the table is patterned cloth. The right half is glass. There's a 3-foot drop under the glass. Mothers were asked to coax their infants out onto the glass. Would the child instinctively avoid the drop or trust in the glass? Watch what happened.
Aaron. Here I am. Aaron, here's Mama. Hello. Hello, kitten. Oh, Aaron. Aaron. Oh, that's very nice.
Maybe this will help. The infants could feel the solid glass under them. But they could also see the drop. Visual perception won out over touch. Almost every baby refused to crawl onto the glass. And that, say some psychologists, shows an inherited recognition of the dangers of heights. Not everyone draws the same conclusions from the visual cliff experiments. Perhaps visual perception isn't wholly learned or innate, but both. It's a very complicated question, and it's not completely academic. The more psychologists can learn about visual perception, the better the chances for future Arthur Tomasinos to make their dreams come true.